For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. I'm at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, speaking with Gareth Newham about this year's crime statistics. Can you provide an overview of the crimes that increased as well as those that decreased during the year under review?
Well, the crimes that increased are the crimes that drive fear in South Africa. So we've seen an increase in murder and attempted murders, and we've seen an increase in the various robberies, particularly street robbery, house robbery and business robberies, and car hijacking. Crimes that have decreased were your interpersonal assaults, like your assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm, your common assaults, some common robbery went down. The crimes that are least reliable, the ones that fewer people really report because they don't think they're that serious or that the police will do anything about them. But the big story that these crime statistics tell us is that for the first time in almost a decade, crimes that have been going down quite substantially, because crime peaked in South Africa in 2002 and 2003. And for instance, murder has been going down quite consistently since 1994. It's actually dropped by 54%. And for the last 5 years, we've seen quite big reductions in murder, up to 10% in any given year. 1,000 fewer cases between 2008-9, 2009-10, for instance. So suddenly to have murder go up by 650 additional cases in the last financial year should be ringing warning bells. We're talking about 2 additional murders every single day on average. That means that there'd be 650 people who would be around today if murder hadn't gone up last year. That's not a small number. So something big has changed there. And then at the same time, we've seen even a bigger increase in attempted murders. So that kind of violence has really gone up. The other big issue that is a real concern is, as I said, the robberies. Because we've seen big reductions in street robberies also over the last 6 or 7 years. And suddenly to have an increase in these robberies by a thousand additional cases, in addition to almost 1,200 more house robberies. That means that 1,200 households more were attacked by armed gangs than the previous year. So we're talking about large numbers of people if you consider an average of 4 people per household. So there were 1,200 more house robberies, people being attacked in their homes by armed gangs than the previous year. Business robberies, almost 500,000 more businesses attacked by armed gangs in the most recent crime stats compared to the previous year. Car hijacking, which has been going down for the last 6 or 7 years, suddenly going up again. This is what these crime statistics tell us. They tell us that the crimes that are the most serious, that have the biggest consequences for people's safety, for being attacked and associated with murder and injury are going up. That's what the crime statistics tell us. And of course, they don't tell us what's going on right now. This is what has happened in the last financial year ending on 31st of March this year. We have no idea what's going on now. It's really problematic that the police knew this a year ago and have been keeping quiet and not telling people in South Africa, look, your streets are less safe, your homes are less safe, your workplaces are less safe. We need to start working together to solve this problem. If they had done that, we wouldn't have had these crime statistics we saw last week.
Is it fair to blame the police for the increase in violent crimes?
When you're talking about interpersonal violent crimes, it's not something that the police can easily reduce. The reason is that around 2/3, about 65% or so, of murders and assaults and attempted murders take place between people who know each other, typically males under the age of 30 who have been drinking. So there's usually a high level of alcohol usage at the time, and they get into an argument about something, relationships, money, sport, you name it. Start insulting each other, it gets out of hand, there's a fight, and somebody lands up stabbing, bludgeoning, or shooting somebody else in a moment of anger. It's not premeditated. Now, the conditions that lead to that are not something the police can address. The police can only make sure that they respond to call-outs if a fight's happening, to get there to stop the murder from happening or the conflict from spiraling out of control, or if somebody does get injured or killed, that they take immediate action to identify the perpetrator and ensure they get brought before the courts, collect evidence. So that's what the police can do. About 15% to about 20% of our murders, about 1 in 5, are as a result of robberies, where people get killed in their homes or on the streets because somebody's trying to steal from them and they resist, for instance. And then the remaining about 15 or so percent are as a result of what is called intergroup conflict, taxi violence, gang violence, xenophobic attacks, vigilante violence. That make up about 15% of the murders. The police can do a lot about those smaller proportions. So they can reduce robberies and thereby reduce murders that way, and they can reduce intergroup conflict and reduce murders that way. But because the bulk of the murder is outside of what the police can affect, it's not really fair to blame the police if the murder goes up.
Why is murder such an important indicator in the crime statistics? What impact, if any, can the statistic have on the economy of South Africa?
Well, murder is an important indicator because it's the most accurate and reliable crime statistic. When we look at other sources of information around murder in South Africa, for instance, the National Injury and Mortality Monitoring System, NIMS data, which is run by the Medical Research Centre and the University of Cape Town, they go around the morgues and they look at why people have died. So there's an additional and separate independent set of statistics that we can assess against the police statistics. We've also got the National Victims of Crime Survey, where people know of murders, where they're reported to the police. And the reporting rates of murders are about 96% to 98%. So we haven't seen a big shift between what the police say is happening in terms of murder and some different set of statistics. So it's very accurate. Other crimes, for instance, such as commercial crime, a lot of assaults, rape, are very underreported. Maybe 1 in 4, 1 in 9. In some communities, 1 in 25 rape victims reported. So they're less reliable. They don't tell us really much about what the police statistics don't tell us about the extent or the trends in the crime as much. So that's why murder is so important, because it is the most accurate, reliable indicator. And therefore, internationally, when various companies or businesses want to rate a risk in a country, they look at the murder rate. And they compare murder rates between different countries. So murder is often seen as an indicator of stability in the country. A country with a high murder rate is seen to be less stable and less safe than a country with a low murder rate. And so it feeds into people's decisions around doing business, investing, direct foreign investment in South Africa, where they want to set up businesses here and so forth. And of course, having a high murder rate, South Africa's murder rate being almost 5 times the international average, is not positive for our economic development. It doesn't inspire confidence, especially if it's going up amongst those businesses internationally that might want to invest in South Africa.
What are some of the factors that influence crime and violence in South Africa?
Well, the reason why crime and violence happen are quite complex, but the risk factors start off with young children. When you have young children who are exposed either directly to trauma or neglect, in other words, they themselves are beaten, suffer severe physical abuse, it causes trauma in them. If they see their mothers being beaten up, so domestic violence causes a severe traumatic reaction in small children. As they grow up and they go to school, they get bullied, or they see violence in the classroom and the teachers don't act on it, or the teachers themselves are hitting children. They go to clinics or hospitals and the nurses are aggressive and don't pay attention and don't care. The police might be violent as they're growing up as young men in townships. So they see violence all around them all the time, and they start realizing that, first of all, if you want to get something done or command respect, you use violence. So there's a culture of violence as a way of negotiating complex relationships starts becoming apparent. That's why we have a high rate of violence against women and children, because a lot of parents don't know how to discipline children without using violence. A lot of men don't know how to relate to women in relationships without using violence to control the relationship. And that is why we have a high violence problem. And the way you deal with violence problems is you start changing attitudes, you start working with young children, you start working with parents of young children in high-risk communities. So we know from studies going back to the 1960s that if you use social workers effectively to work with parents, to do nurturing parenting skills, to ensure that children grow up in a warm, nourishing environment where problem solving and being able to talk about your feelings and engage in discussions to solve problems as opposed to using violence becomes the norm, the result is a reduction in violence in those societies. And that's what we've seen over many decades of studying violence. South Africa at the moment, we don't do that. Our nurses and our social workers and our teachers are not thought of as having a role to play, and therefore we don't train them on how to teach and respect and work with young people to give them the kind of self-esteem and the self-dignity they need in order to not use violence. When you have that kind of background with a high level of inequality, it's not just poverty. Countries far more poorer than us have lower levels of violence. The inequality is the problem. So if you can't get a job, if you can't, as a young man, provide for a family or get married because you don't have a job, a larger proportion of such young men will start using crime as a way of getting access to economic wealth, especially when you start seeing people that you know involved in car hijacking, organized crime syndicates, using violence to get wealth, are doing well. The police don't ever get them to jail. It becomes an incentive for greater numbers of young men, particularly to start involved in violent crimes such as house robberies and street robberies. That is why we have a violence problem in South Africa.
In the run-up to the FIFA World Cup, car hijackings, house robberies and business robberies stabilized significantly. However, in the 2012-13 statistics, the incidence of these crimes has again increased. Why do you think this has happened?
When we look at the increases, particularly of car hijacking, truck hijacking, business robberies and business burglaries, we know that most of those crimes are committed by organized crime syndicates. You don't just steal a car easily and sell it easily. You don't just break into businesses and steal goods and sell it easily. You need to be part of networks, and therefore they become organized. So when you see these crimes going up, it shows that organized crime is on the rise. When you see a situation in which in 1 year there's an increase of almost 1,200 house robberies, that means that there are new entrants in the market of house robberies. That means that the people who are committing house robberies in the past haven't been arrested and brought and been locked up, and new people are starting to do this because they see it's a lucrative outlet. And that's organized. That crime can be dramatically reduced, and we saw reductions in the past. For instance, in Gauteng in 2009, house robberies went down by 10% because of a change in policing tactics. Setting up dedicated task teams who track and investigate every single house robbery, identify the modus operandi, they start making arrests, they get fingerprints, they process that information. We saw in Gauteng the arrest rates going up by 100% in 6 months, the conviction rate going up by 30%. You start making it more risky for people to do that because those that are doing it are now starting to increasingly go to jail or having run-ins with the police. Fewer people start coming into doing that kind of crime, and we saw a 10% reduction in house robberies in Gauteng. So it's very susceptible to policing. When it starts going up, it means the police are not working or not using the resources that they have available, the technology they have available in a coherent way to make sure that your crime intelligence, your detectives, and your visual policing components are working together and focusing their efforts on these crimes to make sure that the people involved are being identified, arrested, and thrown in jail. That has stopped happening. And that has been happening in the past because we've seen reductions in a lot of these crimes. That they're going up suggests that the police are not on top of these crimes. They're not able to utilize the resources they have to effectively reduce the crimes as they have been able to do in the past.
Why?
Well, it's a leadership issue, to be very frank. When you've had leaders who can bring a organization as diverse and as complicated as the South African police together, to cohere together around a common vision, fighting crime, making sure that divisional commanders, lieutenant generals, very high-ranking people from different divisions sit together, plan together, and make sure that they ensure that there's a seamless approach to some of these crimes, you have success. Of course, the most critical component of policing when it comes to robberies, truck hijacking, car hijacking, house robberies, is intelligence. Because that is where the information gets processed. Intelligence does two things. The one thing it does is look at all the information that is coming out about crime, the statistics, the cases opened in each police station. They can look at the time of day, the day of the week, who's involved, how many perpetrators, the victims, the profiles of the crime in itself, how it was committed. And they then use that information to guide the detectives and the visual policing. So they can guide police operations, on the one hand. The other hand is that they infiltrate. They identify the various networks and can infiltrate them, start spying on them, listening to their cell phones, looking at their email accounts, tracking their financial flows, and they can really start gathering evidence. So crime intelligence is the sharp end of policing when it comes to reducing organized crime. 2 years ago, we saw Richard Mdluli, the national head of the South African Police Service's Organised Crime Division, being arrested on charges ranging from murder to widespread corruption. He was being protected. In other words, investigations into him were halted. The National Police Commissioner was ordered to stop investigating him. So people above him, he said in Parliament, powers beyond me, decided they didn't care if Richard Mdluli was deeply corrupt and involved in serious crimes. They wanted to protect him for some reason. So they stopped the investigation, withdrew the disciplinary hearings. We now heard from the judgment on Friday, Judge John Murphy in the High Court, saying that the decision by the National Prosecuting Authority was irrational, not based on law or fact. So then senior people, we know who they are, Advocate Lawrence Mrebi, Advocate Jiba, the Acting National Director of Public Prosecutions, decided to ignore the Constitution, ignore the law, and ignore facts and evidence of widespread corruption to protect Richard Mdluli. They withdrew the charges, allowing him to go back into the police. When he went back into the police, large numbers of senior police officials recoiled. They wouldn't sit down with him to talk to him, and the cohesiveness you need in a management team fell apart completely. The acting commissioner, Mkhwanazi, said as much of the time he couldn't hold management meetings where they could sit together and speak openly because nobody trusted Mdluli. Mdluli was being protected because he's clearly acting, as his letter suggests, in certain personal political loyalties. He's loyal to the president and willing to use his personal powers, as he said in his own writing, to protect certain political individuals in their travails. So that completely undermines the cohesiveness of the senior management of the South African Police Service, and that filters down into the organization, and people stop trusting each other, they can't trust their leaders, they get distracted from the task at hand as police resources are starting to use political lens, not fighting crime. That is the biggest single reason why organised crime is on the rise in South Africa, despite the vast resources that the South African Police Service have, the experience they have, and the successes they've been able to achieve in the past.
The government has used crime statistics as a measure of police performance, yet you regard this approach to be problematic. Why is this?
Well, crime statistics are a measure of the crime challenge facing South Africa. So we shouldn't see the Minister of Police and the National Police Commissioner presenting crime statistics to South Africa, because they're not the only organisation that can deal with crime. I mentioned earlier that a lot of social violence happens in social contexts and requires other departments. So we should see the government cabinet ministers sitting there as a whole. What are they going to do about improving local government? For instance, one of the reasons the police gave for an increase in crime is that this dramatic increase in violent public protests, largely as a result of failures of local government to deliver consistent services, has meant that they've diverted policing away from fighting crime into trying to stabilise frustrated communities who are blockading roads, throwing stones. So where is the Minister of Local Government to demonstrate what he is going to do to try and ensure that local government service delivery improves so the police can be freed up to do the job that they should be doing, fighting crime? Similarly, we saw the high levels of murder. We know murder is a crime that occurs in various social contexts. Where were the ministers of health, education, social development saying what they're going to do to ensure that their departments provide services that reduce the risk factors that lead to violence in our society? So that's the problem, is that the police see the statistics as a measure of their performance, when it's not a measure of their performance as much as it is a measure of the crime challenge facing South Africa. Specific categories are more a measure of police performance than many of the categories are, and we need to see a coherent strategy to dealing with crime. And while the police see the statistics as a whole as a measure of their performance, there'll be massive incentives to manipulate the statistics, not to share them, especially if they're going up to avoid accountability and to avoid pressures that builds. So we need a mind shift set when it comes to dealing with crime information in South Africa.
The ISS has revealed that there were several miscalculations in the 2013 national crime ratios. Please elaborate on this.
Well, the national crime ratios as presented by the National Minister and the Commissioner of Police are inaccurate. The reason is that when they calculated the crime ratios for 2011-2012, they used statistics that were estimates of the population based on the 2001 census. Now, using ratios in itself is not bad practice, because if you look in murder or assault particularly, you want to know how crime changes, what is your risk factor over time. And because there's a growing population each year in South Africa, you work out the number of murders per 100,000, because that allows you to look at crime accurately over time, because there are more people, so there might be a few more murders, but the risk of being murders might actually go down. And you might be able to, then you can also compare high populated areas with low populated areas, because you'll find in South Africa some of the highly populated areas such as Johannesburg have much lower risk of being murdered than some of the rural areas in South Africa. Cape Town, you've got almost twice the chance of being murdered than in Johannesburg in particular areas, but there's fewer people living in Cape Town. So you need to do that ratio. But when you calculate ratio, you've got to use the divisor, the population estimate is critically important to get correct. So they used the 2011 and 12 estimate that was based on the 2001 census. In 2011, we had another census. They suddenly realized that there were almost 2 million more people living in South Africa. And they realized that that was because their estimates based on the 2001 census were incorrect. So they revised the estimates upwards. And so instead of there being 50 million people in South Africa in 2011-12, they said there were over 51 million people. Now the police used the old 50 million. That means that the number of people that they're using to calculate ratios in 2012 suddenly appear. So you suddenly have almost 2 million more people in the ratio, which makes the crime seemingly go down. The consequence is that the minister is under the impression that sexual assaults have gone down. He's under the impression that business robberies have gone down because of a calculation error, when in fact, based on the hard figures, on the accurate figures, they've gone up. So now you have a minister who's been given inaccurate information. He's telling people that certain crimes are going down when they're going up, and he may be going before Parliament to give them inaccurate information. It's critically important that these statistics are done properly, correctly, so that we have correct information to know what we're dealing with here. So far, the police have refused to engage on this matter and refused to rectify it. We are actually calling for the minister to institute some kind of inquiry, ideally independently, because this statistical error came from within the police. We have reason to believe it might not be an accident, But he needs to ensure that there's an independent inquiry, possibly led by Stats SA and the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, to find out who calculated these statistics and why did they do it, when such an error is fundamentally incorrect and would have been picked up by many people in the police who have enough background experience not to make that error. So why did that error occur, and that needs to be investigated.
That was Gareth Newham of the ISS discussing the 2012-13 crime statistics.